So we're here today to talk about the book Networks, SMEs and the University, authored by Andrew Johnston and Robert Huggins. We're talking about this because for Praxis Oral members, SME engagement is really a perennial issue. A strong desire for universities to do more with SMEs, which tend to be lumped together as a group and characterised as disengaged or hard to engage with. That's possibly more pertinent than ever now as we come through this COVID period and come out of the COVID period, finding ways in which we can support SMEs to come back from the crisis, but also increase university engagement from the get-go as well. So the book challenges some of the assumptions I think we've made about SME engagement in the past by getting under the skin of the why, the how and the where that SMEs collaborate with universities. Looking at the data, which we're often led by in our conversations about the sector, but I think really importantly, talking to SMEs about the why they choose to collaborate with universities and how that process has gone for them and their perceptions of success or impact, as we like to call it when we talk about university business collaboration. I think one of the things that came out for me in the book was this note that the sector data suggests that SMEs are increasingly important to UK universities, but are universities as important to SMEs? And I think that really gets to the crux of the matter here. We're very data-led. We need to hear more stories from the actual businesses that are doing the collaboration and why they do it. So Andrew and Robert, I'll just ask you both to introduce yourselves, and then Andrew, maybe you can talk a little bit about how this book came about and your interest in SME university collaboration.
Hello, I'm Professor Andrew Johnston. I'm a Professor of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the International Centre for Transformational Entrepreneurship at Coventry University.
Robert, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Rob Huggins. I'm Professor of Economic Geography at Cardiff University, and I've got a long interest in looking at university industry links. I look around economic development and knowledge, innovation, entrepreneurship. So this is all connected to my key core areas of research.
And I think that's how the genesis of the book really, Rob and I have been working together for about 15 years, looking at issues around innovation and entrepreneurship and regional development. And one of the projects we worked on looked at the contribution of universities to regional economic development, and our interest kind of was sparked from there really. So following on from that, we looked at various other aspects of networking and universities and business, and one of the things we got to, we'd mainly taken a quantitative approach. I think one of the questions we then had was, how does this work from a kind of business perspective, and how does this work from an SME perspective? Because as you alluded to, Tamsin, that the SME community is reasonably neglected in terms of their links with the university system. But if a closer reading of the literature suggested that these links aren't non-existent, that these links do exist, they're just maybe less obvious or less engaged with the universities, and the empirical work that's been done so far focuses more on larger firms that have the resources, has the time, have the connections to the HE system that SMEs don't have. So the genesis of the book was really to try and dig a bit deeper into issues to do with SMEs, and how does it work in terms of university collaboration from an SME perspective.
Yeah, and I do think it's it has been a conversation that certainly I've been involved with for many years throughout in my career at universities and latterly with Praxis Oral. I think some of those assumptions that we make, they inform how we react in terms of the tools that we use for SME engagement, right through to the policies that are made for incentivising SMEs to engage with universities. Perhaps a good place to start is talking about what is an SME. I mean, we talk about this group as if they're just as we talk about universities as a kind of homogenous group, but of course there's lots of differences between SMEs. So do you want to just unpack that a little bit, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, we've really followed the traditional definition of SME. So it's basically those businesses that employ fewer than 250 people. And we know that the business community is 99% of businesses in the UK and across Europe are these kind of firms. So they to get just to label them as one category maybe is a little bit disingenuous, because we know that there's differences between micro businesses and small businesses and medium businesses, but generally we're talking about smaller businesses. And typically the SMEs that we look at in the book have a number of employees at around about 20 employees only, so they're the very smallest businesses in the business community, those that perhaps possess fewer resources, fewer networks through which they can innovate, and those that maybe stand to gain from a kind of open approach to their innovation and utilizing inter-organizational networks to leverage external knowledge.
So it's the ones that we've looked at in many ways, they have the will, where they have the capability of something else to innovate. And to me, they seem to be in a sort of group around more entrepreneurially driven SMEs. And, those really play, to me, a really key role in terms of the future economic development of the places, the cities and regions in which they are located, and they can have a big bang for their buck in a way. Particularly, we're thinking about COVID now and where development's going to come from. These SMEs can play a vital role, I think, in progressing certain economies.
Yeah.
And the thing about SMEs, when you speak to them, and we've done a lot of projects looking at sort of smaller businesses over the years, when you speak to the entrepreneur or the owner manager in charge, they are responsible for a lot of the function in the business. So they're very heavily dependent upon maybe one person or a small team to run them. So the kind of resource constraint is a capacity constraint of the top senior people who they don't necessarily have the time to be doing everything. The main aim of their business is to keep it going, is to keep it competitive, to keep the order books full, to keep the orders being delivered. So innovation in that scenario is maybe an added extra, as Rob says. They stand to gain an awful lot from doing this kind of thing, but they are really constrained in terms of having to run the business and operate the business and the opportunities to do that.
Yeah. Do you think that's one of the most significant differences in terms of thinking about SME collaboration compared to, the large corporate collaboration? It's that resource. I suppose on the flip side, in an SME, because it is, the culture that an SME business leader can create in a company might be have more impact than you find on the corporate side, where it's a much more, there are different levels of responsibility and decisions about where innovation happens and how it's commissioned.
Yeah, it's two sides of the coins in a way, that the SMEs are seen as agile and responsive to change because they're small and because they don't have a large corporate structure to hold them back. But at the same time, you're right, you hit the nail on the head that larger firms, they projects such as an innovation project can be delegated to a team within the business, and the rest of the business can get on with continuing its day-to-day operations. In an SME scenario, that core team is maybe running the innovation project and it's trying to run the business at the same time. So yes, that is the major difference, I think, in the resources they can commit to looking ahead to innovate and innovating itself.
I think it's in the larger firms, it's their ability to absorb failure. And if we look at the literature around open innovation, we see there is a lot of failure, however you see it. But there's very little in terms of returns and outcomes from many projects by these larger firms. But they have the capacity to move on. They have as Andrew saying, you say, they're well resourced. For the smaller firm, obviously, it's stands to reason they have bigger impacts on them in terms of success or failure. And I think it comes through in the book as well, is their future thoughts around where they would collaborate again with the university.
Yeah.
It's a lot of it around the perceptions of what is success and failure by entrepreneurs and SME managers. And often I think that, and we pull this out in the book in many ways, that the success is sometimes just other than things that other than a new product, with changes in processes and just changes in with the mindset within the company.
I think that's something that's coming through quite strongly now in some of the business analysis that's being done kind of as the COVID lockdown continues, the impact on business, and the sense that actually it's business resilience that will need to be focused on rather than necessarily new products and services. And the point about leadership is coming through quite strongly as well. So that's interesting to hear. And I think, we abuse the word innovation a bit as well when we talk about university business collaboration, because innovation can happen in many different ways. Of course, it's not just about that new product or service. It's about, adopting digital tools and techniques, which of course we've had to do in a crisis these days, seeing how that's actually had an impact on the way people work and the kind of processes they use. So it'd be interesting to see if that endures beyond the crisis as we go on. So you spoke to a number of companies for your book. Did you have many of your expectations challenged when you spoke to them? Was the evidence surprising in terms of, did you look at the data first and then go and speak to the companies, and did it, how much did one reflect the other, really, is what I'm interested in.
We had an idea of what we wanted to look at from previous work we'd done. So we had an idea of open innovation and networks and networking, of how that process began. But when we spoke to the companies, I think what was striking was what I described as the good, the bad, and the ugly of these collaborations, in that some people were almost gushing in terms of how successful they were and how much it really worked their business. Others were so scathing in terms of it hadn't worked, and there were those in the middle. But despite the fact there was this sort of good, the bad, and the ugly approach, they were all in the main happy to re-collaborate with a university, and there were lessons learned, I think, from the process. So it never seemed to be a waste of time for these businesses at all. Yeah. Even those that it just didn't work. They were happy that the collaboration hadn't worked or the output hadn't worked. But yeah, they were. I think the most surprising result was the different types of learning that were available from these projects. So it wasn't just about creating something new or creating a product and selling it. It was just the very act of, oh well, we can work with the university. We've made a good connection here to work in the future, or we found a different way of doing it, or we found how we can collaborate, or how we can work around issues. So I think it's enhanced the sort of capabilities and the organizational learning of these SMEs just to go through the process. But yes, despite the fact that some were very unhappy with how it went, they were ultimately not that dissatisfied by the actual process.
Yeah, that's interesting. Did you get a sense that there were different types of engagement, whether they were maybe doing a research collaboration compared to using facilities and equipment, or whether there was, IP is often cited as a barrier as well as time, but and of course some methods of engagement are less IP heavy than others.
We deliberately focused on formal research collaboration, so the results really focus on those. And I think one of the things we found was a lot of informal activity had underpinned these formal projects. So it wasn't that the businesses or the SMEs came out of nowhere to partner, although that could happen. It was really this kind of undercurrent of informal activity, informal networking that brought them together in the first place. And I think this was one of the results that came through quite nicely in the book, the social side of things, what we refer to as social proximity, that the actual connections of the actors, so that people within the businesses had connections to universities, or they had connections to people who had connections to universities. So I think that was quite interesting there. But yeah, in terms of the types of project they all worked on, they were various different things, from, I say, softer softer activities that were more around sort of organization of the business and how they might run, maybe customer management software, that kind of thing, to some some high tech high tech software to run parts of machineries that did various new tasks and things. So yeah, there was a very diverse range of activities going on here, but they were all focused on sort of research projects.
Yeah. So I mean, you talk about the social side of that, which is really nice, because we always say that knowledge exchange, it's about people at the end of the day. You can put all the processes you like in, but if you just don't, sometimes it's just a matter of getting on with two people getting on, or two teams managing to get on and work together, as in any type of collaboration. But how much does that then relate to place? Because I think the other assumption that's often made about SME engagement is that it's a local thing, that SMEs will want to go to their local university for engagement. How much did that come through in your research?
We looked at the various types of proximity in terms of thinking about proximity, in terms of cognitive, whether you have a similar understanding about different areas and different disciplines, and obviously the spatial proximity. If spatial proximity is available, so there's a good university available, well, obviously they would tend to go towards that. They would like to work with those, but only if there is an academic or an institution within the university that they feel is applicable for them. So proximity is not at the spatial proximity, at least, is not at the top in terms of their priority. It's more around the understanding of relational, in terms of knowledge, sharing around technologies, etc. And then if there's something spatially available, yes. But really it's about developing the relationships that we said. It's very much a social, behavioral, human process. Now, I'm not sure where this would be this. We never really see this coming from the literature that looks at open innovation with big companies. We don't see this focus. If the SME manager develops a good relationship with the academic, they really feel they want to go back to repeat business and have more and more collaborations down the line. So the key priorities around some of this sort of more behavioral proximity, I think, or cognitive proximity, as we call it in the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as Rob said, I mean, we were interested in the spatial side of things, looking at the physical manifestation of these networks. But I think what came through quite nicely from the book was that, as Rob said, it's about understanding, it's about connecting. So the physical side of the relationship, the physical manifestation of these networks is driven by the social and the ability to understand each other. So what we see is, when we've done sort of quantitative work in this area, these models all show a significance of spatial proximity. That it is important that the businesses are close to each other. But I think these results maybe turn that on the head a little bit and say that this proximity is a result of these other proximities. So it's the interaction of people, it's the understanding of people. So yes, it may go, if you're in a city, you go to a local university, but it may be that you've had a connection with somebody, and it doesn't matter where they are once you've got that connection. I think the average distance between the SMEs and the universities was about 70 odd kilometers in the ones we spoke to. So it's around about an hour's drive, which is reasonably close in a country the size of the UK. So we're not talking over hundreds of kilometers, but but I think it's these sort of networks they're in and the interaction they are undertaking sort of prior to collaborating that is driving the formation of these ties. And then we see a kind of local or a regional bias in their behavior, because that comes through from what they do in terms of networking. It's not necessarily deliberately about finding a local partner.
Yeah. And I suppose that does come back to some of the incentives, which are getting more and more kind of place-based in their focus. But it's hard sometimes to define that geography either precisely enough so that it makes an impact where you want it to, but broadly enough so you're not kind of excluding different types of actors. But also, that principle of recognizing excellence wherever it exists. And maybe that comes back partly to company size. So if you've got the time and the resource to go and seek out expertise, then you will do that. And if you haven't, then you rely on those existing connections or just a more local source of expertise. But that dynamic is very interesting. So I mentioned some of the barriers which we tend to think of when SMEs work with with any companies work with universities, which often, it often comes down to IP and time and cost. Were those the things that came up in your research as well? Were there other things that really popped up as barriers to engagement that universities might want to think about?
I think one of the barriers that came out, one of the most sort of pertinent barriers was the communication. They needed to sort of settle into a communication pattern, and this goes back to what Rob was saying about the human side of the interaction. I think that again, it's about time. It's about getting to know each other. It's about learning how to work together and how to understand each other. Once those barriers have sort of been worked out, the collaboration sort of proceeded. But there was I think I don't think it's exclusive to this type of collaboration necessarily. It's maybe any kind of collaboration would find this, but it's about sort of finding your feet within the team and learning to work together is probably the most significant barrier that was encountered. And then once you can work together and understand one another, the collaboration goes reasonably smoothly.
Yeah, I think as we know, as we all know from previous work, one of the perennial issues is the different ideas around time. That the SMEs are looking for relatively quick wins, or at least to see some value early on, whereas academics can tend to be more patient, understanding of the long term in a way. And differences in those perspectives can lead to some frictions, I think. And it's very difficult for universities to work at the same speed as some. In a way, that's one reason why they prefer to work with larger corporations, I think, because that they are operating larger operations more as a university in some respects. How we get around this, I'm not sure. But it can lead to, as I say, some problems in terms of the relationship. Those who have been patient, those SMEs, they clearly at the end of it have seen that value. And if they've been through the process previously, if they sort of have serial relationships with the university, they have a greater understanding. So it's almost sort of trying to take them through it and say, well, stick with it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, when we talk about corporate engagement, we often talk about long-term strategic relationships, that are corporate, like a Rolls-Royce, for example, would, have a few carefully selected university partners that will, last for many years, and they set those kind of parameters for engagement right at the outset. Now, there seems to be a way, a kind of message that SMEs can't work in that way, but I don't see why they couldn't in a way. Once you've got over that initial hurdle of learning how to work with a university, maybe a particular university, then you're right, you haven't got that kind of transactional cost the next time. You've got over those barriers, and it should make it easier next time. So in that sense, if you're looking for a repeat business, you are establishing a longer term relationship. It might just not be framed as such. I think that's something for universities to think about, definitely.
When you look through the data, you see plenty of repeat collaborations in data. If you look on the gateway to research, you can see that a lot once a link has been established, it does carry on, and this is for larger and smaller firms.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Let's talk about the value of the engagement, both because if we think about the data, I'm thinking about the HEBSIS data here, the sector data that's collected annually for Research England. I look at the SME data sometimes, and I'm quite surprised at how different it looks depending on whether you sort it by kind of number of engagements or the value of engagements. You get very different sets of universities at the top of those lists, and you can, if you do some fairly basic maths, you can be quite surprised at the low value of some of those engagements. So what kind of values are SMEs getting out of these engagements, even if it's not a high cost? What's the kind of value they're getting out of it?
Oh, I think the things we found in the book, that the value they get is an enduring relationship, or they've collaborated with somebody, but also they've then got someone to speak to in the future, and to go back to, maybe informally. They've got a resource there, an extra resource. Secondly, they've managed to prove to themselves, they've the value to the firm, have proven themselves. They've come up with an idea, they've worked with the university on it, they've seen it through to the end. It may or may not work. They've sort of learnt to learn in a way. It turns them into more of a sort of learning orientated organization. So it's not just about value in terms of money or revenues. It's about what's valuable to the business. So it gives them a way of looking at things differently that way. Those that have been through sort of KTP type interactions, a lot of them take on the associate as a full-time member of the team. So again, they've got an extra resource. They've got a person who's joined the business and brought extra expertise into the business, so that's now embedded in the business. So I think there's quite a lot of value to be had for an SME in these collaborations. That's not just monetary.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it is around, as Andrew said, it's just the opening of eyes, really. And the different options and the multiple routes that they can take forward in terms of developing their businesses. We say not just products, but around processes as well. So again, it's not necessarily around short-term wins. It's a lot of it's around changing the sort of the culture and the culture around innovation within the business.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think that's something that the metrics just don't capture in the sector data. And I suspect that's because we are so data-led in the way that we think about university business collaboration and the incentives for that. I think there's a danger that we just keep kind of coming up with the same problems and trying to solve them in the same way, because we don't really, unless you're very familiar with that data, you don't kind of look behind it. But yeah.
If you look at somewhere like Silicon Valley and you look at all the money that's invested through VCs, through Stanford universities, you would have thought that some of the output measures around patents and around R&D would be so much higher. But yeah, Silicon Valley survives, thrives, because a lot of this around these sort of intangible benefits.
Yes.
Around changes in culture, and what it still brings in the best talent, and over the long term has these increasing returns.
Yeah, and it's about those creating those connections, creating those ecosystems. That's the other great buzzword at the moment, isn't it? Creating ecosystems so that that informal learning does take place, I think. And then when you need to reach for the expertise, you know where to go for it.
I think Andrew and I both agree really that all places really going to have some form of ecosystem as they move forward. And what we've looked at in a way, these university SME links are the microcosm of what will be a feature of these ecosystems, across larger cities, smaller cities, and other more peripheral regions. So I think what we've got something we can look within the ecosystem, and hopefully some lessons can be learned from there.
Yes. And maybe that could, that's a good point to think about. I mean, obviously you wrote this book pre-pandemic. You are kind of editing it through the pandemic, and it's being published hopefully as we exit the pandemic. So an interesting kind of gestational period for it there. I've alluded to some of the things I've seen from the university side, certainly setting up more services that are more aimed at business resilience and maybe at training. There's certainly programs in SME leadership that's being led through the Northern Powerhouse, I think. It sounds like these are the right directions for universities to be going in terms of the type of value and the type of support that SMEs might need. Do you think there are other opportunities that might arise from the pandemic, perhaps in the use of digital technologies that will make it easier for SMEs to access that kind of support?
I think it's like we're doing now, talking on Zoom, breaks down a lot of barriers, and especially if we're talking about the social side again, and people being able to talk to one another. I think universities and the academics within them need to be sort of open to SMEs and the SME community, and try to break down those communication barriers where, maybe the pandemic has got people more used to being on Zoom or Teams or whatever, and just talking to people not in a virtual world and working from there. So I mean, maybe there's an opportunity to think about it in different ways. We don't need to have sort of a big conferences. We don't need to think about it in terms of quite such a hyper local context, but we can say, universities are there, let's try and make contact as we've been doing through the pandemic on Teams and Zoom. Let's try and can outreach be changed, can networks be extended through digital means? I think there's a great opportunity there. Yeah.
Do you think there's a role also for digital brokering? I mean, it's something that there's been a few attempts at digital brokering. I don't know, I think on the praxis oral side of things, there's a feeling that you do need that face-to-face. We talk about knowledge exchange being a kind of contact sport, but for that initial opportunity spotting and opportunity sifting, I sense there might be a role for more digital brokering type platforms.
I think that's a good idea in terms of trying to, again, break down these barriers that we were talking about earlier. Some of the parts of the book, we were looking at how the SMEs sort of assessed credibility of the partners, and it's generally done in a kind of high level fashion in terms of what department they work in, what's their title. So if you're a professor of computer science in a department of computing, therefore you must be the expert they need. But the problem is when you go to university websites, or you look at a list of publications, that it's maybe in technical languages that the business world doesn't necessarily use or speak. I think maybe the brokerage system would try and say, what's my expertise is this and this. So I might be a professor of this discipline, but I'm interested in these areas. I can work in these areas with business. So that might be a way of sort of simplifying the kind of communication. So SMEs can make a better judgment of the credibility of the academic, and maybe pick a more appropriate academic than they may have done if they're just sort of going about it a bit more blindly in terms of they're at university of wherever doing this topic.
Yeah, I think that's where we see the role of the broker coming in. It's that kind of translational activity, isn't it? Understanding both the language of the academic and the language of the business. And it comes back to your point about the points of that common language between SMEs, in the technical space. So you recognize your herd, as it were. You recognize where people really understand your business issues as much as they understand the potential for your type of business. And yes, I mean, a lot of academics, their knowledge exchange is around know-how as much as it is around the specific piece of research that they're conducting at that moment. So that's important as well.
And as Rob mentioned earlier about the ecosystem, I think sort of a kind of brokerage system needs to be ecosystem wide. LEPs and chambers of commerce, other kind of laboratories or other businesses, maybe all feeding into it to signpost one another around the whole ecosystem. Maybe ultimately to a university or a university and someone else. But I think if it's if the ecosystem is part of this brokerage system, then that strengthens it massively.
Yeah. So you've got it bounded by that locality, but also you've got that, you're kind of making those local resources more known and the different actors that can.
Well, I think all the evidence so far from COVID is going to say that processes of innovation are going to become more spatially distributed. And obviously we know that access is easier, through things as this, through Zoom. So, it's logical to have some kind of broker who can act as a filter in a way to see whether there could potentially be some value in terms of these relationships. This is what large corporations have done for many years, isn't it? Employ someone to take a gatekeeping role. SMEs haven't got that resource. University to some extent have it in place, but I think they need someone, a broker who's on the side of the SME in a way.
Yeah. Doing that collection and the filtering and the collation. Yeah, no, that's interesting. We've been speaking for about half an hour, so probably time to we'll draw things to a close. But is there anything that either of you particularly wanted to mention in terms of the book and the themes that we haven't covered?
I mean, really, we hope that the book gives an insight into you know, the SME community, the practitioner community, and as well as the academic community about how these collaborations work, and you know, that gives insight into maybe what businesses are looking for, how, you know, what kind of outcomes to expect. We've done a literature review that kind of gives a overview of what's known so far, kind of state of the art in terms of SME university interaction. So I mean, hopefully it's quite you know, useful to you know, all communities who are interested in knowledge transfer involving universities, really. I think also the other thing was, going back to one of the things we said at the beginning, SMEs are very diverse, and you know, we've spoken to 20 odd SMEs in this, and we appreciate the fact that there are, you know, many millions of SMEs out there, and there's all kinds of different versions of SMEs, and you know, rural SMEs, micro SMEs, maybe startups, who all probably have a different variation on this theme. So I think that's areas we will be looking to explore in the future with our work as well. So, you know, going forward, we'll be trying to answer more questions in this area, but I hope the book, you know, gives a good starting point for the community.
I think in the book as well, we've touched upon and tried to sort of show that over time, over history, universities have played a strong role in terms of the economic development of the UK, and their links with industry, and has led to flourishing around clusters around certain parts of the UK. We know now that we're going to be living in a more entrepreneurial environment. Smaller firms, SMEs, are going to play a big part. They've always played a big part. And I think it's time for universities, for policymakers, to ensure that SMEs are central in terms of thinking about, because this is what happens, is what's been happening in the US in a way. You know, more and more focus we put on growing SMEs, you know, and that term about scale up. I think we need to do that within the UK, and ensure that university links with SMEs are sort of centre in terms of thinking about future policy. Yeah,
absolutely. That sounds like a great note to end on, Rob. Thank you both very much for taking the time, and you know, for being so engaged with Praxis Oral around the book, and with your research. I'm looking forward to kind of keeping track of what you're going to do next.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks very much.